First of all, thanks everyone for joining in and taking the time today. My name is Pam Persichetti. I am the Alumni Engagement Officer at TCNJ. And this is our Industry Insiders webinar series, which is brought to you by the Alumni Engagement Office. So again, thank you for joining us. I'm sure you'll find this quite valuable. I know it's a hot topic, so I'm interested, as you all are, to hear what our panelists have to say today. Couple of reminders before we jump in. Please remain muted. I know most of you are, and thank you for that. If you could remain muted throughout the presentation, that would be great. And at the conclusion, we are going to hold a question and answer session. And if you would submit your questions through the chat feature at the bottom of the screen, that would be great. You can I will facilitate the questions at the end. You can submit them throughout the presentation. You don't have to hold your questions until the end, and then we will facilitate them at the conclusion. So I am going to introduce my co-moderator today, Dean Suzanne McCotter. She is the Dean of the School of Education, as well as a professor in educational leadership at the college, and she's been at TCNJ since 2017. Suzanne received her bachelor's and MLS degrees from Rutgers University, followed by a doctorate in middle school education from the University of Georgia. And recently, Suzanne has worked with the New Jersey State Legislature regarding issues surrounding diversity, diversification, and teacher shortages in the state. Before her time at TCNJ, Suzanne spent 11 years at Montclair State University in various roles. And Suzanne is joined by 3 of our wonderful faculty today. Thank you all for making up our panel of experts today. Suzanne is going to introduce our faculty members, and they'll do a little bit of introduction themselves. So I will turn it over to Suzanne to begin the panel discussion. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Pam. So you heard from my introduction that I spent time at Rutgers, Montclair, and TCNJ, and I'm so glad I finally got it right. TCNJ is the place for me, and I'm really glad to be here. Pam, I'm not sure if you said that if any of you have questions, you can type them into the chat and we will get to all those questions at the end. We've saved time for Q&A. So I'm really happy to introduce my colleagues who are here with me. And we're going to let them introduce themselves, but let me briefly tell you that I'm looking across the top of my screen. So just starting to the right next to me, Dr. Lauren Madden is from the Department of Early Childhood and Elementary Education. Lauren is actually on sabbatical this semester, so we are particularly grateful to her for giving up some of her time. Dr. Jonathan Davis is from the Department of Educational Administration and Secondary Education. And Dr. Michael Smith is brand new to us, but not brand new to higher education. He joined us this year from SUNY New Paltz, and he is in the Department of Special Education, Language, and Literacy. So I want to give the 3 of you a chance to introduce yourselves and tell a little bit more about you. So tell us what your focuses are, and also, if you're comfortable, what's your home situation look like right now? So Lauren, can we start with you?
Hi, everyone. So yes, I'm on sabbatical right now, which looks very different than it did 8 weeks ago. And my academic and professional life this year looks quite different than it had for the previous 8 years. So I am a science educator and an environmental educator, and I teach courses in some general pedagogy as well. But right now my home situation is a little bit different. I have twin 7-year-olds who are in 1st grade in a public school here in New Jersey. They're in 2 different public school classes and have markedly different experiences with e-learning, even when 2 classes in the same grade in the same building. So my day-to-day schedule is quite different than it's ever been before. So I am up about 5 in the morning. And I work for 2.5 hours before anybody else wakes up. Then my kids get up and I manage the homeschool situation for a few hours that way, trying to get the different assignments done and manage 2 1st grade classes in my house. And my husband's an essential worker, so he's not home most of the time. Then the rest of the day is trying to shoehorn in my work when I can and do some creative projects and try and get the kids outside. And I'm ready to collapse by about 8 o'clock. So that's pretty much what my day-to-day looks like right now.
Thanks, Lauren. Jonathan?
Hi, I'm Jonathan Davis. I was a high school social studies teacher. I started my career in Northern Kentucky and then taught in New York City in both Manhattan and Brooklyn. Still live in Brooklyn, New York. So for us right now, it's a little extra scary, just really being at the true epicenter. At TCNJ, my work is I coordinate and help start the urban secondary education 5-year program. I work very closely with Trenton Schools, and I coordinated and co-coordinated the middle school specialization for many years. And my research and work is really on culture responsive, sustaining pedagogy and practice, and work on really kind of melding all of my work together to work with both in-service and pre-service teachers in creating truly great, practical, culturally responsive and sustaining teaching practices. So for me, my home life is also a challenge and a joy all at the same time right now for many reasons. My wife and I have 2 kids under 3. We have our oldest is about to turn 3 and our youngest is 7 months old. And so for us, the challenge is having 2 kids who are 100% dependent on you at all times, and trying to educate our 3-year-old who misses her childcare dearly, and trying to structure a day with a kid who struggles with structure. So like Lauren was saying, trying to do things outside and creative projects every day, reading tons of books, while also making sure that potty training sticks. It's a real juggling act, and most of my work is happening right now after 9:30, 10 p.m. My wife and I are trying to she's not an essential worker, but is also working full time. So we're trying to coordinate schedules and try not to both be working at the same time. And it's, we're doing the best we can.
Thanks. Michael?
Hey, so my work primarily in terms of my scholarship and teaching focuses on issues of teacher preparation for equity and diversity. And so I look at teacher identity and how that interfaces with how teachers experience themselves, how they experience others, what stories do teachers tell about race and how race works in the class, the politics of education. And so in this time, I think a lot about the politics of education and educational equity and educational access, who has access to opportunities and who's sort of shut out. And thinking about the pandemic and our current social cultural moment, those things are on display more than ever. So I'm looking forward to the conversation we'll have today about those issues. As far as home life, like the others and like all of you, it's very different than it has ever been. So I have a 6-year-old who's in 1st grade, and because sort of in education, and my wife has a job that she's working from home and can't be interrupted. I'm doing full-time 1st grade teaching and full-time professor work as well. And so trying to find a schedule that works is something of a challenge. But I think what has been really useful for him is his days are now very predictable. I mean, he knows that homeschool with dad starts at 9, and then we're going to do this, and this until lunch. Then there'll be a break, and then we'll do this, and this. The challenge with that, though, is where's that professor time, right? So if his schedule is great, my schedule is now in flux. And I know I commend Jonathan for being able to work in the evenings. I really feel like Lauren, by the time I get to 8 o'clock and he goes to sleep, I'm ready to sleep too. And so I think that's the biggest thing that we're trying to manage is there's only a certain amount of time in the day, and where you allot your bandwidth ends up being super critical.
Thank you. And I'm sure that these situations sound familiar to a lot of you who are logged in here. You're trying to juggle all the being a home teacher and being a professional at the same time. It's really difficult. My kids are 20 and 25. I do have them both in the house right now. And my only challenge is that they sleep all day. And so I don't really get to see them, and I worry about them. And is that a signal that they are depressed, or is it just because that's the age they are? So I think that all of us are trying to figure out, are we doing okay? Are we doing enough? Are we doing the right things as parents? That's often, often our biggest challenge, and in this time particularly so. So I'm going to ask the three of you, Lauren, Jonathan, Michael, as parents and as people who've been K-12 teachers and people who are now preparing teachers, teacher educators, what kinds of advice do you have for parents whose children are learning at home right now? Go ahead. Jonathan, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think a really big piece right now is making sure that learning is something that doesn't feel like a job, and it's something that can still be enjoyable and fun. And I think that we talked a lot about in preparing for this call, the link between social emotional learning and academic learning. And I think that right now, for any parent or guardian who's trying to support any age child, K through 12, in terms of the distance learning, is to make it so that the learning is something that seems like it's meaningful. It's something that can be enjoyable, and it's not something I just need to do. And I think that that's the real challenge. One of the many challenges right now, as the distance learning looks so different across the board. And I think Lauren was going to talk a little bit about, like, within the same school and different teachers, how different it can be. And so I think just if at the heart of it, we can focus on trying to make the learning meaningful and enjoyable and fun, it will make their experiences now better, and will hopefully make the transition back into school in person a little bit easier.
Go ahead, Lauren, and then we'll get to Michael.
It looked like Michael was just about to talk too. So I'm, you're okay. All right. Yeah, I would second what Jonathan said. The fun piece has to be part of it. I think also thinking about the timing, the homeschool guidelines for people who homeschool full-time, and that's a totally different kinds of conversation, is that children, K through 2 need 2 hours a day of instruction. That's what we're looking at. So I know some of the parents in my network have been very frustrated that there's just this stuff for them to do, and some of the teachers have compensated with sending a lot of what really seems to be busy work along the way. I think everybody's trying to figure this out as we go along. We have to remember this is brand new for everyone. There's no one in our continent has experienced something like this in this kind of time. And I think we need to give grace to the teachers, and we need to give grace to our fellow parents as much as we can, because it's a new world. I think for parents, you need a lot of patience with your children, more than usual, and understand that things that they're capable of, they may have breakdowns about, and frustrations will come up. One of my sons has some fine motor issues and gets some occupational therapy, and he needs a lot more encouragement right now than he ever has before, and that's changed things a little bit. I also think, if possible, this is a time to show your children something that you really love and are passionate about, and let them see you learn and explore a little bit, and that will help them to think about ways to learn and explore. So we've gone on quite the baking extravaganza and culturing yeast on our counter and things like that, and it's really helped me connect as a learner with my children, and I'm trying to take advantage of that sort of opportunity now too.
Lauren, I know we said we weren't going to share screens, but if we were, I'd like you to show that focaccia that you put on Facebook last week. It was amazing. Michael, do you want to add to that?
I'll just add briefly. I think in the same vein, I think we need to think about how do we manage our expectations for both ourselves and our kids. And so just because they're in school from 8 to 3 doesn't mean we have to have an 8 to 3 day. So going along with what Lauren says, like what is a reasonable amount of time for them? What breaks do we build in along the way, being gentle on yourself. And so like, I know there are times where I beat myself up. I'm like, oh, I have not this meeting, but I have a meeting to go to, and it's going to interrupt his day. And so like, oh, I'm going to have to park him in front of Netflix for an hour and a half or 2 hours. And like that guilt of that, like, well, that's just what it is right now, right? And so because I'm also working, his school has to fit around my responsibilities, and my responsibilities also fit around his school. And so I have to remind myself that it's okay. And the uncomfortable fact is that we may be in this pattern for a while. So what can we actually do? And then you do the thing that you can do each day. And so there are some days where I think I really nail it as a professor. And then there's other days I feel like I really nail it as a first grade teacher, and other days where I'm not sure if I'm doing good at either. And you know, the next day I'll just try it again. But something about like just managing the expectations along the way and figuring out what is the best that you can do at any one time is like, I guess, the best piece of small advice that I would add to what they said.
Thank you all. So we don't know what next year is going to look like. We don't know what the state of public health will be in the fall. We don't know what public schools are going to do or private schools. It's hard to predict what back to school is going to look like. But given that uncertainty, how should parents think about getting their students ready, their children ready for the next academic year? And this is different at different levels. And Jonathan, maybe I'll throw it to you first, because I think one of the real challenges is for parents of high school and middle school kids. How do you get them ready for physics if they haven't really finished chemistry? How do you get them ready for French 3 if French 2 has been cut short?
Yeah, and I thank you for that almost impossible question to answer. It's a real
My pleasure.
Yeah, it's a real challenge, and I think that we also need to be attuned to who are the parents in the home. You know, I think that right now, if we're just talking to the members who are part of this webinar, you know, everybody on this webinar is a TCNJ grad, an educator, and that's going to look very different than parents who never completed high school, or if there's one parent in the home versus two parents, or if people are, you know, have the virus, or if they're essential workers, or if somebody is a foster child. I mean, there's so many different challenges that we need to consider. And so, you know, I think in terms, if we know going into the fall, or if we think there's a chance we're going to be continuing with distance learning, you know, I think the best thing we can do for middle and high schoolers is to just keep their confidence in terms of where they are at academically. And so even though we may not, you know, hit all the prereqs to allow them to thrive in a new physics course, if they want to do a calculus-based physics, but they don't know calculus yet, or they didn't get to finish the academic year, I think that if parents or guardians can just focus on the importance of students retaining the skills that they've been working on and getting as much practice with them as they can, and just reading a lot, which is, I think, similar advice to elementary, is just like the more we can get our students to be reading about their content, talking about it, conversing, finding great apps that you can put on an iPad or a tablet or a computer or a phone that gets them thinking about the content and the subject area, even if they're not learning and mastering new skills and content. I think that's going to put them in a place where next year, wherever they start, they're going to be hopefully able to work with their educator, who's also had a summer to prep for it, to better support the students who are going to be coming in at different places. Because a big part of the educator's job in prepping for next year is going to be, how do we account for for sort of that lag that happens, oftentimes in summertime anyways, but where students are going to be coming in at very different places. So how do we do some reteaching? How do we support where students were in March when all of this happened, and understand that real differentiation is going to need to take place? So from the parent side, all you can do is do your best and try to get students to really focus on, again, engaging in critical dialogue and discussion and reading as much as you can in all of the different content areas that they're going to be exploring next year.
Thanks. I really love that advice about trying to keep your child's confidence up, so that they're not going in feeling really apprehensive about what they haven't learned. Michael, can I turn to you, because I think one of your background in special education and looking disparities and equities, I think that one of the things we might be concerned about is kids who have special needs and whose needs haven't been able to be met. We already know about the summer slump, particularly among kids who have special learning needs. So how should we be thinking about that?
And I think toward what Jonathan was saying in the end of his remarks, I think the main thing thinking for the fall is, how do you hold the lines, right? And so in general, in the best of times, we have some learning loss, right, over the summer. And I think teachers generally plan to have to reteach some things that happened before. But wherever the student is along the spectrum, like how do you at least hold where they are right now? And so hopefully students who have OT or PT, hopefully they've been given some things to do in order to sort of maintain skills right now. But that doesn't substitute for like being actually in a place where a service provider who's trained can do that. And so like parents can do their best with it, but it's not exactly the same. I think one of the best things you can do right now is read as much as you can with your child. Have them write as much as you can. I'm thinking particularly around middle school and elementary school age kids. And think about ways in which their interests can lead the kind of work that you do. So for instance, like my son, he's writing little books. He's in first grade, like I said. And so he has these little writing assignments. And right now I have him writing stories in ways that he hadn't been assigned to do any of this stuff. And so he wrote a little book on awesome athletes. And so he wanted to, we look up YouTube tutorials on how to draw like Michael Jordan. And so he's following that. So we're going to call that art. And then he looks up little books on each athlete, and then he reads the book, and then he writes the 3 sentences that he's interested in. Like these things are like driven from him. Doesn't matter so much what he does, but he's writing. As long as he's doing writing every day, he's reading every day, he's doing those things as often as possible. I'm trying to at least hold his reading level. If he ends up starting the next year better, awesome. But at least we want to hold what they have, and I'm hoping that that other parents can do sort of similar. The other thing that I would suggest is like parents can look at their social networks if they have them for other people who are doing work too. So there are a lot of parents who are trying to figure this stuff out. And there are communities on Facebook, there are communities on Instagram where people are sharing resources, things that have been working for them. So we're in this together, we're in it differently together. But I think we can reach out to people who are similarly situated to see, like, in your circumstance, what are you doing? How can I replicate that? How do we get our kids together, even virtually, to do some of that work? And I guess finally, in terms of advice for the fall, I think you're well within your rights to try to communicate with the school leadership at your kid's school to say, what's the plan? How do you see us getting our kids prepared for the fall? So like I I think that's a reasonable question for the teachers to say, what should we do? What, my kid, what can I do to help my kids get ready for the next year? And what are you all doing? I think those are all reasonable questions.
Thanks, Michael. And I would add, part of my background is as an English teacher, so I would definitely co-sign to the recommendation to read and write a lot. I would also say some of you who are on here are probably literacy educators, but if you're not, you don't have to be. It's totally fine. You don't need to worry about whether or not you're teaching them the right way to read or write. More reading, more writing is going to help them become better readers and writers. So you don't need to worry if you're teaching them exactly the right skills, just give them the opportunities to do that. Lauren, do you want to add something here?
Yeah, so I think along with the reading and writing, which I think are two of the most important things children can do and should do, I've had several long phone conversations with the principal at my children's school. She's got kids similar age to mine, and this might be a little bit of an unpopular comment, but I think we all, for everyone in this particular audience, I think we have to remember that the fact that we're even asking these questions means that we're incredibly invested in what's going on. And I have a child walking in the middle of my talking. Sorry about that. I think, the principal at my children's school let me know that it took until the middle of week 6 to reach every child in the school and their families. There are some kids that we have not, that have not had a lot of contact, and we got to keep that in mind. I think along with the reading, I think keeping mathematical reasoning, especially for younger kids, central to what you're doing. I try and speak aloud about recipes or the clock and the time, and talk a lot about that kind of stuff. And the science educator in me, I try and do a lot of close watching and close observing. Just, we take a walk every morning before we start mommy school. And I think getting outside and making them move around and get some fresh air before we start thinking is the best thing we can do. But we look to see, are there worms out on the sidewalk today? What kind of birds do we see? Are the flowers still on the trees, or are they not anymore? Why do you think that is? What are the names of these streets? Why do we call this a township? Why is this different than that? Really trying to get into the everyday science and social studies sides of things and get them to be good explorers of their own land is a really good way to sort of keep them fresh in that area too.
Thanks, Lauren. So we don't know what the fall is going to look like, as we said, but let's assume now that schools are able to open next year and kids are able to be back in schools. It's still likely that this series of events will have made some changes in schools and teaching, that whatever the next normal is will not be the old normal. It'll be something new, something different. What do you think will be changed about schools and teaching next year? Jonathan?
I mean, I think a lot. One is, the move to this virtual learning. I think people are understanding, one, we live in a virtual world, and we're at a place where it's exposing a lot of inequities that many of us already knew existed, and where there was real reliance on people to be able to use computers and access Wi-Fi. And so my guess is, as we transition to next year, if we're back in the fall, is that a lot of districts that have moved towards more of a one-to-one experience, I'm trying to look at in the positive light, that hopefully a lot of educators who were more resistant to using technology have been able to learn more about different ways to use Google Classroom and different apps. And so, on the positive side, I think that schools will hopefully positively be transformed in a way where the use of technology in the classroom in person is going to be much stronger. I do think it's going to change, though, also significantly, where when people return to the schools, depending on the individual experiences that each student had, that's going to transform the dynamics in the school and in the classrooms, because there are going to be plenty of students who have lost loved ones. There are going to be plenty of people who never were able to log on to a computer, even if it was dropped off at their home, because there were 4 people in their house that needed it. They weren't able to get Wi-Fi for multiple reasons. And so those dynamics and those experiences that people may have had, for instance, walking around and certain populations still getting targeted by police more than others, and so people are going to be bringing in stuff that had been bottled up for months with them back into the schools, and we don't know how it's going to transpire. And so I think as educators, we already wear a million hats, but I think that the new normal is going to be us as educators having to prepare for really being attuned to what's going on in our students' lives. How do we support those transitions from home life to school and back? And how do we integrate that with still the skill and content development? And it's going to be a real challenge.
So the new normal might not be all negative or all positive. We might be more creative in how we use technology, but we're also having to think in a different and much more complicated way about social emotional learning.
Right.
Lauren?
Yeah, one of the things that I keep going back to when I'm thinking about the fall, when I was a middle school teacher in Columbia, South Carolina, I had it was during Hurricane Katrina. I had students who were displaced from Katrina in my class, but it was 3 or 4 in each class. It wasn't a whole room full of kids who've been affected by the same event, which is a little bit different. And I wish as a young teacher that I had a better skill set related to the social emotional learning of those children. I mean, it was an urban school, and I understood enough about teaching in that kind of setting. I didn't know how to teach students who'd experienced that sort of trauma in a way that was probably the best. So I find myself reading a lot of these post-Katrina stories, and that's, I'm teaching our capstone class in the fall, and that's the first thing we're going to start with is what can we learn from the children who experienced that 10 years out, because I think there are a lot of things that maybe aren't intuitive, and we have no idea who so every school's gonna have a safe room in case somebody's showing symptoms and has to be isolated. And there's gonna have to be some sort of physical distancing. We see those pictures of the children in China right now with the masks and the hats that keep people 6 feet away from them. I can't see that happening in America, but something is going to happen in America to see what it looks like. And how does having that sort of costume on change the way a child or a teenager behaves in a classroom? I think we have to be really open to being learners as well as teachers, and trying to help figure out the best way, the best next steps every moment of every day.
Thanks, Lauren. Michael, you want to add to that?
Sure. I mean, overall, I think it's going to have to be a paradigm shift in how we think about our roles as teachers and who students are overall. And so, I mean, already within a class, you have students from lots of different backgrounds, different ability levels, all of that stuff. And your schema for your kids is sort of normatively situated. Okay, so here is a second grader, here's what second graders should know, this is what they can do, et cetera, et cetera. Well, that cohort of second graders that are going into the classroom in the fall, some of them were able to maintain their trajectory, leaving first grade, landing into the fall classroom. Others will have a regression, but there's still going to be in that classroom, they still will have matriculated anyway. So like, you're supposed to differentiate instruction, and part of what we think about around special ed is differentiating instruction, universal design for learning. That's going to be even more important because the levels of the kids who are going to be in the classrooms are going to be so much wider when we go back. One of the things that I'm sort of concerned with is what story do we end up telling about these kids as they're further removed from this pandemic period. And so while right now we know there's an asterisk on this semester, as we move further out, do we remember it's not necessarily their fault that they don't know this information. They haven't been there. In terms of the way they interact with their peers and their teachers, was very different with just my son working with me versus, I don't know, I guess maybe he shouldn't interrupt me while I'm reading, but I have a different sort of patience level for him interrupting with a point when we're reading, as opposed to sitting in Magic 5 in classroom and raising a thumb when he has to respond. Like some of those routines are just a little different with homeschool and how you interact one-on-one with a parent versus once you're a part of a class again. Like Jonathan, I think thinking through how do we start from a place of leveraging technology will have to be where we start in the fall. And so in my son's class, for instance, they started off the year using Seesaw as an app to communicate with parents, to share work, all of those sorts of things. And so when it came time to pivot onto remote learning, they already had a platform that the kids had been trained on all along to share their work with, to share their work through. They were already proficient in using Seesaw. We as parents were already proficient at using it. So it was a relatively seamless transition. I think other teachers are going to have to figure out, well, what's my platform? How am I going to use this? How will I use it for instruction, for communicating with parents, et cetera?
Thanks, Michael. And some of what I hear you saying, and Lauren, you said it explicitly, is we're going to need to change the way we prepare teachers so that we're thinking more about technology in different ways, but also more about the trauma-informed practice and social emotional learning, and they probably emphasize different things within preparing teachers. So I think that you've alluded to some of the big issues, the big problems that have emerged in the field of education. What might typical New Jersey residents not be aware of that's going on behind the scenes in education? And perhaps these are new problems that have come up as a result of the pandemic, or perhaps they're things that are illuminated in a different way at this point. What kinds of things should we all, as concerned citizens, be thinking about?
Go ahead, Michael.
You start, Michael. Jonathan started every time.
Okay. I'm happy to let him continue. He's on a roll. So there's a couple. One of the things that I think when Lauren, one of her opening remarks, she was saying that we should have a little grace and patience with teachers as well. And I don't know that people, A, know how hard it is to teach, period. But B, how hard it is to teach online, particularly if you haven't been trained to do that work. And so unlike a typical lesson, you have your content knowledge and you have a whole cache of skills that you develop, and then you teach that material. Well, online you have your content knowledge, and then you have to think about well, how do you teach that? Then what's your platform to be able to teach it? What do you have access to? What does the platform allow you to do or not? Do the students have access to whatever platform you're planning to teach through? Do they have proficiency or not? There's all of these things that are mediated between your initial idea of what you had to do and then what transparency that the various people have along the way. Like it's just hard. And so I think that for teachers who haven't thought through that process, they're getting a crash course and doing it right now. On the equity side, I think there's a lot about the politics of schooling that this sort of reveals, right? And so when we think about asynchronous versus synchronous teaching online, so are we all going to be on a classroom call together, or am I going to give you a list of assignments to do, and you'll do them and turn them in at the end of the week? Either way you go, sort of privilege really dictates how deeply you engage with the content. So for an asynchronous classroom, it may be great to have us all together. It's very possible that there are a lot of students who don't have a quiet place where they can work. It's possible that there's only an iPad and a laptop, or maybe there's only a laptop and there are multiple kids who need to be on. It could be a parent who's working who needs to be on. So that choice to mandate that everybody be together to be taught in one sitting suddenly enfranchises some and disenfranchises others. And so, like, we could have our best intentions to have an asynchronous class to keep it normal, but it shuts some people out. I mean, I think the access to technology is very, very disparate. When we first did our pivot to remote learning, I had a student tell me that I'm writing my paper right now on my phone. I don't have a computer. I'll get it to you when I can. I think we just assume that well, everybody has access to technology, and they just don't. I mean, a lot of these equity things and just how varied the access to educational opportunity is so wide right now. And then I'll stop. Right now, I'm supervising practicum students who are in the field a couple of days a week. And it was interesting to see a snapshot of just how different schools are actually doing this right now. So it varied from people who seamlessly moved online because they already were comfortable with doing Google Meet and all of that, to schools where they were, where the copy machine was running all day and they were Xeroxing as many packets as they could to send home. And so, like, I wonder, for the kids who are in schools where they just got a packet in March, how is their schooling continuing? I mean, doing packets is an unsustainable long-term way of doing school versus schools who are still regularly doing content, doing instruction. And I said I was going to stop, but now I promise I'll stop after this one. So there was this really interesting article in the Wall Street Journal a couple of days ago about districts that just decided this was too tough, and they just stopped altogether. And I don't know, I think that there's something to thinking about just how inequitable that is. Like those kids still need instruction, right? Like, yes, it's hard, but the choice to stop schooling altogether because it's hard, I guess, I don't know. I don't want to say it's unacceptable, but it's unacceptable. And again, the equity or inequity in the way that schooling is being experienced is, I don't know that we've all thought really deeply about how different kids are being schooled right now.
Thanks, Michael. And you started out by talking about the real complexities that go into being a good teacher and how many decisions teachers have to make all the time. And we saw at the beginning of this, we saw a lot of appreciation on social media for teachers. And I really hope that persists, that's something that continues and is a change. One quick housekeeping thing before I ask Lauren and Jonathan to chime in. This is our last big topic. So if you have questions, please type them into chat and we'll get to them after we're finished. So Jonathan, do you want to add to that? about the problems that might have emerged that the typical New Jersey resident might not be aware of.
Yeah, yeah. And, I just want to really build off of what Michael was saying, because I was also going to go straight to the equity issue. And I think that right now, we are all in our own bubbles. And it makes sense. Like, we understand our world, and it's hard to try and think about somebody else's world. And so because of that, I think it's important for New Jersey residents to really think about the differences and how this is impacting different schools and communities. So for instance, I work very closely with Trenton schools, and Trenton was one of the districts that did the packets in March. And so, they're Xeroxing a lot, they give the packets out, and then principals hand deliver computers to houses for them to be able to access it. And that's great, but still, even delivering computers and technology, it may be the only computer now in the whole house for multiple people. There may not be access to internet. Plus, in terms of being able to get online, maybe even navigate the technology, if the student doesn't know how to do it and the family members don't know how to do it, then there's no way to get on. And so when we look at the practicality, is that in districts like Trenton and other districts, there may only be 20-30% of the students that are going online to do whatever was posted to Google Classroom or whatever other platform they're using. And so, and I think it's really hard for teachers and administrators to prepare for that, because they don't know what are the students really doing, because they're not getting that contact. And so as teachers and educators, we also need to think about that also from the lens of, one, we don't want to be in a deficit mindset. We don't want to be blaming individuals who are encountering very challenging circumstances and therefore unable to do schoolwork, when if we were in their position, we wouldn't either. And so, and that's only the education side of it, is that the inequities that exist right now, I think that they're just being highlighted and sort of enhanced in some ways of things that already existed, but because different people in different districts aren't necessarily seeing that, when we return to the new normal, my biggest worry and concern is that we take a look at, well, why did these students in this district not be able to thrive when we were able to make that happen, when we worked so hard? This was hard on us, and it was hard on everybody, but it's been hard in different ways. And so as educators, as parents, as just concerned residents and citizens, we need to be just kind souls and human beings and thoughtful in how we think about we can move forward as a community to support one another. And that once we're able to see where everybody's at come the fall, that we truly are there for one another, versus being more accusatory of, well, you weren't able to do this, but I was able to do that. And so if we can make that happen it's going to take great leadership, and it's going to take educators to go outside of their comfort zone, but that's the hard work. That's what we got to do.
Thanks, Jonathan. Lauren, you want to chime in?
So when you asked the question, I was going to go right to equity as well. So it looks like we're all in the same place that way. I think, if we're really thinking about what the general public doesn't necessarily know, is this process of this constant reassessment and changing that's happening. I'm really trying to put my teacher hat on here. Might seem like, oh, well, last week it was Zoom. Now it's Google Meetings. Why'd they change that? Why do we have to learn this new thing? It's changing as they have more information, they're doing more. And sometimes that can seem really frustrating and confusing, and feel like, again, as I put my parent hat on, I've heard from some other parents, well, they don't even know what they're doing. They're changing it every week. That as we get more information, we do better things, and that providing. And sometimes things seem confusing because they're supposed to be more equitable. So I'll give one quick example. I know of one teacher who's trying to make some very short videos. describe some activities and lessons. And the reason why they're short is because not everybody has Wi-Fi and not everybody has access to machines all at the same time. However, not everybody's a teacher, and not everybody in the middle of the video stops to pause so that their child can get a pencil and paper. And if we're just going to grab some Wi-Fi outside McDonald's right now, we actually can't do that either. So there's probably an elaborate set of instructions, maybe in English and Spanish, and there's this really short video. So it feels like the parents are getting all kinds of crazy information, and the purpose of it is to make sure it's as inclusive as possible. So I think, I don't want to sound too Pollyanna here, but I think assuming good intentions and assuming these many changes are because we're getting more information about how to make the technology and the instruction better, I think could be a helpful way to think moving forward. And I don't think the public sees the constant changing as a thing that's necessarily good. Well, we had 20-minute videos last week. Why do we only have a 4-minute video now? There are really good reasons for that, but you know, and maybe you don't want to have to explain that there's 3 kids in this class who don't have Wi-Fi at home, or so-and-so's mom has the virus and that she's a single parent and we got to have as minimal amount of time of instruction as possible, or whatever else there.
Thanks, Lauren. Pam, I didn't see any questions for us to respond to. Are there any questions in the chat that I missed?
I did have one come in privately.
Okay.
It looks like this is more for high school. Is there any advice you can offer for apps geared towards high school students, older students?
And anyone can answer that. We're all looking, I'm looking at Jonathan. You probably can't tell that. I'm looking at
Yeah,
Jonathan, but anybody can
looking.
answer that.
I'm looking at you, Jonathan.
Yeah, I appreciate the looks. I mean, I just needed to be transparent. It is not my expertise at all. I'm kind of learning as I go. I talked to a social studies supervisor in Hopewell a few weeks ago about this as well, and I don't want to just make up answers. So I would rather put it to Lauren or Michael, who might have better answers of concrete apps that are working right now.
So I don't have a good answer about which concrete app for secondary, because unlike elementary, well, I was gonna say unlike elementary, but in high school, everything is sort of siloed into your chemistry, into your algebra, into your history, et cetera. And so what you may end up doing is looking for apps and resources specific to the content areas, instead of thinking sort of globally about what does my 9th grader or 10th grader need to know. So what courses are they in? And then what sources can I find? And again, there's some really good parent and teacher groups on Facebook, for instance, that are collaborating to share as many resources as possible of things that have worked and things that aren't doing so good. I wish I had a clean answer to say, oh, this is your history app. But I think if I were in that situation, I would look for the specific content area and then say, what are you all doing? And maybe this is something that you can also reach out to your other peer parents to say, okay, so Timmy is struggling with Algebra 2 right now. What are you doing with Jimmy for Algebra 2? My son's in a dual language Spanish program, and I had a parent say, I don't get this homework that they keep sending home to our kid. What are you doing? So my wife speaks Spanish, I don't, but I'm doing most of his his teaching right now. And so we talked about, like, what are the strategies that I'm using at work? And we sort of leaned on each other in the process.
Thanks. And my husband is a high school chemistry and physics teacher, and I think he'd probably say the same thing, that it's very dependent on the content. So he's directing his students to specific YouTube videos and using Google Classroom a lot, but it's not the same as having the specific kinds of apps as it is for elementary school. Pam, are there other questions?
Great, thank you guys. Yes, we did get a question. How can we address self-motivation with students who may not have a parent available to be that extra push for their students?
Sounds like it might be a question from a teacher. Who's got any advice for how you can keep kids motivated?
I think if you, and also Sarah's one of my former students, so hi Sarah. I think it's, if there are students who don't have parents who are able to support them, I think that if as a teacher you can create some type of network where the students are still able to interact with one another and create more of that virtual community, I think that, and maybe you can even create some fun games with what you're teaching, where all of a sudden now the students can motivate one another, because we can't know the exact home situation of everybody, but we can, we know our own classroom community, we know our students. So if we, all we can do is know that we're creating a community that is supportive and is challenging as possible and engaging as possible. And so I would say that if you can just stress the support of one another within the class, then it will help those who already have parental support, but it'll also help those who may not have it. That's just my take.
Thank you.
Lauren or Michael, you want to add anything to that?
And I guess the place to start is to think about, well, how do you motivate kids in the classroom when you have them in the class? I mean, that's a departure point to think about it. And I mean, if we're thinking about remote learning, to what degree can we make how they access information as seamless as possible for them? And so right now, it may be harder if they weren't trained on how to use Google Meet or whatever Google Classroom. It may be harder, but as we look toward the fall and what we do, I think making it so that the students know what to do, how to do it, and that becomes part of their normal, so that they can take some ownership of their learning. And then, sort of like Jonathan was saying, having them accountable to each other, where so it's not just them not doing the work for themselves, but how do they collaborate with others? How do they stay in community with the classroom? I think it helps with some of those things.
Thanks. We're almost at the 1:30 mark, but Lauren, if you've got anything to add, please chime in.
Or any other questions, please feel free.
Just briefly, I think same as in a face-to-face classroom, whenever you can integrate student interests, do so. My son with the handwriting issues, who hates holding a pencil and hates writing, got assigned, similar to Michael's son's, to write a short story about an animal of his choice, and wrote 10 sentences about great white sharks because he was allowed to do it by his choice. So I think as much as, and I know that's a really first grade kind of example here, but I think even for older kids, any way you could make their final product, creating a TikTok video or doing something that's motivational for kids of that age, I think is a plus.
Thanks. Pam, anything else from the chat?
Doesn't look like it. Doesn't look like it. But I think I think all of you covered so much in the panel discussion that it really did shed some insight for all of our attendees. So thank you all very much. Thank you for taking the time and your time and talent. Yep, we have a couple other people thanking you all as well. I don't know if you can say.
Thank you. Thank you, my colleagues. Thank you for giving us some of your time today. Thank you, alumni, for coming. And Pam, thanks for organizing this.
Thanks, everyone. Stay safe. Stay healthy.
Thank you.
We're even getting some applause hands.